February, 1888. The wind did not howl. It was a lower sound than that, a physical pressure that made the logs of the cabin groan. Out in the blackness, it was 22 degrees below zero, a temperature that had ceased to be weather and had become a form of judgment. Inside, Agnes stood before the door, a lantern in her hand. The light caught the frost of her own breath, a small, recurring ghost in the cold air. Her hand was steady on the iron latch. She had been alone for 5 years, but she had never felt more prepared. A frantic pounding echoed through the wood, a sound nearly stolen by the storm. She knew who it was. She had been expecting him, in a way, for 2 days. She lifted the latch. The wind tore the door from her grip, slamming it inward against the wall. A figure stumbled in, followed by a blast of white that was not snow but ice, ground to the consistency of sand. He fell to his knees, a man made of snow and desperation. It was Reverend Miller. The frost in his beard had frozen into a solid mass, and the certainty he always wore like a cloak was gone, stripped from him by the cold. He looked up, his eyes wide and vacant with fear. He tried to speak, but his lips were cracked and clumsy. He swallowed, and the words finally came out, ragged and thin. "We are dying, Agnes. Our wood is gone." She looked down at him, her expression unreadable in the flickering lantern light. She said nothing. She simply closed the door against the storm, the heavy wood muffling the sound of the world ending. She looked at the simple plank floor, at the worn bearskin rug near the hearth. Underneath it was a secret the size of a church, a truth she had carved out of the earth with her own 2 hands. Where in the world are you watching from tonight? Let us know in the comments below. We read every one. Agnes had not always been alone. She had arrived in Prospect Creek 10 years earlier with her husband, Thomas, a man as quiet as the mountains he loved. He was a surveyor, a reader of maps and stone, and he had taught her to see the land not as a thing to be conquered, but as a series of truths to be understood. He brought her books from his trips to Denver. Not novels or poetry, but dry, practical volumes with titles like Principles of Geology and The Farmer's Almanac for High-Altitude Husbandry. While other women in town quilted and gossiped, Agnes read about soil composition, water tables, and structural engineering. She learned how a load-bearing arch worked, how to read the clouds for a coming storm, and how different types of rock held or shed the deep cold of winter. When Thomas died from a fever that swept through the valley one autumn, the town of Prospect Creek observed the proper forms of grief. They brought casseroles. They offered prayers. But their sympathy had a time limit, and it expired quickly. The world had a place for a grieving widow, but it was a small place, a dependent one. A widow was meant to be absorbed, to become a sister-in-law, an aunt, a quiet burden in the corner of someone else's home. Agnes did not fit. She did not weep in public. She did not petition the church for aid. The week after Thomas was buried, she was on the roof of their cabin, replacing shingles the wind had torn loose. She chopped her own wood. She mended her own fences. Her hands, which the other women expected to be soft with sorrow, grew calloused and capable. Her quiet competence was seen not as strength, but as an unnatural pride. It was an affront to the established order of things, a silent refusal to be the helpless creature they expected. The rejection was not a single event. It was a slow, steady freezing out. Conversations would stop when she entered the general store. Invitations to quilting bees and church socials never arrived. The town's skepticism was given a voice by Reverend Miller. From his pulpit, he spoke of the dangers of self-reliance, how it was a form of pride that shut out the grace of God and the fellowship of community. He never used her name, but everyone knew who he was talking about. Martha, the storekeeper's wife, put it more plainly one afternoon, just loud enough for Agnes to hear. It isn't right for a woman to be so capable. It tempts Providence. The unspoken belief was that her independence was a kind of dark magic. Her thriving garden was not the result of her understanding of crop rotation and mulch, but of some unholy bargain. Her well-repaired cabin was not a testament to her hard work, but a sign of her unnatural heart. The final break came a year after Thomas's death. Reverend Miller and 2 members of the town council arrived at her door. They did not remove their hats. Miller explained, in a tone that was both paternal and condescending, that the town charter stipulated that land claims must be actively worked. A lone woman, he implied, could not truly work the land. They were concerned. They suggested it would be best for her to sell the claim for a modest price and move in with a family in town who could look after her. It was not a suggestion. It was an eviction notice, delivered with a pious smile. In that moment, Agnes understood. The community was not a safety net. It was a cage, and she had refused to enter it. They would not help her. They would simply wait for her to fail, and then they would take what was left. She looked at the 3 men standing on her porch, their faces set with the grim satisfaction of those doing what they believed was right. She did not argue. She did not plead. She simply said, "Thank you for your concern, Reverend. I will manage." She closed the door on their stunned faces. The lock sliding into place was the last sound of her old life. She was no longer a member of Prospect Creek. She was an island. And winter was coming. That first winter alone was a brutal teacher. The cold was not a force, it was a presence. It seeped through the chinking in the logs, it radiated from the stone hearth even with a fire roaring, it lived in the floorboards. Loneliness was a physical weight, a silence so profound she could hear the blood moving in her own ears. The cabin, once filled with the small sounds of Thomas, his low cough, the scrape of his chair, the heavy fall of his boots by the door, was now a hollow vessel. Her only companion was Fen, the shepherd dog Thomas had raised from a pup. He was a large, sable-colored animal with intelligent, watchful eyes. His presence was a small, warm anchor in the vast, cold emptiness. There were days she did little more than feed the fire and stare at the grey light filtering through the single window. The physical suffering was precise. Her fingers, even in gloves, would go from a searing burn to a dead numbness as she chopped wood. Shivering became a constant state, a deep, internal tremor that made her teeth ache. More than once, she would feel a wave of dizziness so strong she had to crawl to the water bucket, her vision swimming. This was not dramatic hardship. It was the slow, methodical grinding down of a body by relentless cold and insufficient calories. One night in January, the temperature dropped without warning. A fierce wind rose, and her woodpile, which she had thought was sufficient, proved to be anything but. By midnight, the fire was down to embers. By 2 in the morning, it was dead. The cold rolled into the cabin like a tide. She piled every blanket she owned on the bed, Fen curled against her back, a desperate, living furnace. But it wasn't enough. She lay in the dark, feeling the cold sink into her bones. This is it, she thought. This is where it ends. It would be so easy to simply stop fighting. To let the shivering cease. To let the cold take her. She thought about going back to the town, knocking on the Reverend's door. She imagined the warm oatmeal she had always hated as a child. The thought was a temptation, a vision of warmth and surrender. She could go back. She could beg. She could become the helpless woman they always wanted her to be. Then, something shifted. Fen, sensing the change in her, the deep stillness that precedes surrender, pushed his cold nose into her hand and licked her fingers. It was a simple, animal act. A call back to the living world. Her body responded before her mind did. A deep, shuddering breath. Then another. And with the breath came a sentence, unbidden, from one of Thomas's geology books: the Earth holds its own heat below the frost line. The frost line. The point where the seasonal cold surrenders to the planet's deep, abiding warmth. The idea was a single, tiny spark in the frozen darkness of her mind. She did not sleep for the rest of the night. She lay there, thinking. Not of survival, but of engineering. The next spring, she began to dig. Her initial plan was modest, a simple root cellar, a place to store potatoes and carrots through the winter, deeper and more insulated than the one she had. She chose a spot near the hearth, where the floorboards were loosest. She pried them up and began to excavate the cold, dark earth with Thomas's spade. For 3 days, she hauled out bucket after bucket of dense, rocky soil. It was grueling, back-breaking work. On the 4th day, the spade hit something different. It was not the jarring shock of granite, but a dull, scraping thud. She knelt down, clearing the dirt with her hands. It was a layer of shale, dark and flaky. Beneath it was a thick seam of compacted clay, cool and damp to the touch, the color of wet stone. She stared at it, her heart pounding. She recognized it instantly from a diagram in a book on mining. It was a geological formation known for its stability. Easy to carve, yet incredibly strong. It was the perfect material. The land had provided what the people would not. She did not feel relief. She did not feel joy. She sat on the edge of the hole in her cabin floor, the scent of damp earth rising around her, and felt a sensation she had no word for. It was the feeling of a key turning in a lock. It was a profound and quiet sense of rightness. The root cellar was not the project. It was the beginning of the project. She looked at her dog, who sat watching her, his head cocked. "We have work to do, Fen," she said, her voice rough from disuse. The digging had just begun. The work became her entire world. The seasons turned, but for Agnes, time was measured in buckets of earth hauled and inches of tunnel gained. She rose before the sun, her breakfast a simple bowl of oats and a cup of chicory coffee. Then she would descend the ladder into the growing darkness beneath her home. Her tools were few and specific. Thomas's spade, its edge kept sharp as a razor on a whetstone. A pickaxe for breaking up the more stubborn layers of shale. A system of buckets on a rope and pulley rig to haul the excavated earth up into the cabin. And a wheelbarrow Thomas had built from scrap lumber and a salvaged wheel, its constant groan a familiar song as she moved load after load of dirt and rock outside. She did not waste the earth she removed. She packed it against the exterior walls of the cabin, creating a thick, insulating berm that rose halfway to the roofline, a silent, earthen fortress against the wind. The digging was a slow, brutal process. Her hands were a permanent landscape of blisters, callus, and cuts. Her shoulders and back ached with a deep, persistent fire. Some days, she would emerge from the tunnel at dusk, covered from head to foot in clay dust, too exhausted to even wash before falling into bed. Fen was her constant shadow, her silent partner. He would often lie at the edge of the pit, whining with concern until she emerged. Sometimes he would venture down the ladder with her, his claws scrabbling for purchase, and dig enthusiastically at the softer soil, sending sprays of dirt flying, as if he understood the grandness of the project. His companionship was a bulwark against the crushing silence, a reminder that she was not entirely alone in her subterranean world. She was not just digging a tunnel, she was engineering a space. From the books, she knew the importance of structure. She learned to arch the ceilings, a shape that distributed the immense weight of the earth above. She timbered the main passages with pine logs she felled and shaped herself, setting them with the precision of a master carpenter. The project expanded from a single passage into a network. A main corridor, wide enough for the wheelbarrow, ran 30 yards from beneath the cabin to a second, hidden exit under a dense thicket of elderberry bushes. Off this main artery, she carved chambers. The first was the woodshed. It was a vast, dry space where she began to stack firewood. She worked methodically, felling deadfall pine and aspen from her land, cutting it to length, splitting it, and hauling it into the tunnel. She did not think in terms of a single winter's supply. She thought in decades. The stacks grew, cord upon cord of neatly arranged fuel, a library of warmth. The next chamber was the pantry. She built floor-to-ceiling shelves and began to fill them. Every summer, her garden produced a bounty that astonished even her. She grew potatoes, carrots, beans, squash, and hardy greens. She learned the arts of preservation from her books. She canned tomatoes in glass jars, their red a vibrant promise of summer in the dead of winter. She braided onions and garlic and hung them from the ceiling. She dried herbs, their scent filling the cool air. She traded the few pelts she trapped for sacks of flour, salt, sugar, and beans at a trading post a day's ride away, avoiding the general store in Prospect Creek entirely. The shelves filled, a testament to her foresight and labor. The final chamber was a small living space, a refuge within the refuge. It had a small, efficient stove she had salvaged, with a cleverly designed flue that vented smoke up a hidden shaft that emerged in the center of a hollowed-out tree stump 100 yards from the cabin. She furnished it with a simple cot, a table, and a chair. This was the heart of her creation, a place where she could survive even if the cabin above was burned to the ground. The community remained a distant, hostile presence. They saw the ever-growing woodpiles outside her cabin before she moved them underground. They saw the smoke from her chimney. They saw a woman who simply refused to fail. Her continued survival was an irritation, a mystery they solved by labeling her a witch or mad. Reverend Miller continued his sermons on the folly of pride. Children who wandered too close to her property were punished. They did not see the blisters on her hands. They did not hear the groan of the wheelbarrow. They saw only a woman who did not need them, and for this, they could not forgive her. She had no ally but her dog. She sought no proof of her worth from them. The proof was all around her, in the cool, silent, fragrant dark. It was the weight of a jar of peaches in her hand. It was the solid feel of an axe handle. It was the sight of 100 cords of dry, stacked wood. It was the quiet, steady hum of security in a world built on chance and prayer. She had built a fortress not of stone, but of preparation. A kingdom of one, dug from the earth, hidden from the judging eyes of the world. She had what no one else in Prospect Creek had, certainty. The great blizzard of 1888 did not arrive. It descended. For a week, the sky had been a strange, bruised yellow. The air was unnaturally still, the usual mountain winds holding their breath. Agnes felt it in her bones. Fen was restless, pacing the cabin, his ears flat, a low growl rumbling in his chest. She made her final preparations, checking the seals on the hidden exit, topping off the oil in her lanterns, ensuring the ventilation shafts were clear. Then, one afternoon, the world went white. It was not snow. It was a vertical river of ice and wind, a solid, roaring curtain that erased the landscape. The temperature plummeted. 10 below. Then 20. Then 30. The wind was not a sound anymore, but a vibration that shook the teeth. It was a storm that had no precedent in living memory, a storm from an older, angrier world. Inside her cabin, Agnes was calm. She lit the stove, the small space quickly filling with a gentle, steady warmth. She moved the bearskin rug, lifted the heavy trap door, and the scent of earth, wood smoke, and preserved food rose to greet her. She and Fen descended into her silent, protected world. Above, the storm raged, a distant, muffled roar. Down here, the lanterns cast a steady, golden light. The air was cool and still. She had food for a year. Water from a small, hand-dug well in the lowest chamber. Fuel to last a decade. She was safe. In Prospect Creek, it was chaos. The town was utterly unprepared. They had trusted in mild winters, in God's providence, in the assumption that things would continue as they always had. Their woodpiles were meant for ordinary cold, not this monstrous, devouring entity. Within 2 days, families were burning furniture to stay alive. The snow drifted higher than the rooftops, sealing people in their homes. The livestock froze in the barns. The general store supplies dwindled to nothing. It was no longer a town. It was a collection of frozen, isolated tombs. On the 3rd day of the storm, Reverend Miller's own firewood ran out. He sat with his wife and 2 small children, wrapped in every blanket they owned, their breath pluming in the frigid air of their own living room. The cold was winning. He could see the life draining from his family's faces, their skin turning a pale, waxy blue. He had preached faith. He had preached community. But faith could not stop frostbite, and the community was just as helpless as he was. There was only one place left. One person who might have prepared for something like this. The woman he had scorned. The woman his congregation had cast out. The thought was a bitter pill, a humiliation so profound it made him physically sick. But the sound of his daughter's chattering teeth was worse. Pride was a luxury he could no longer afford. He and 3 other men from the town, their faces grim, set out for Agnes's cabin. The journey was a nightmare. The wind tore at them, the snow was a treacherous, shifting landscape that swallowed them to their chests. It took them 3 hours to travel half a mile. They were not men of authority anymore. They were just desperate, freezing animals. When they finally reached the cabin, half buried in a drift, they hammered on the door, their last reserves of strength failing. Agnes opened it. She stood there, framed by the warm light of her cabin, a stark contrast to the frozen hell they had just endured. She was wearing a simple wool dress. She was not even shivering. Reverend Miller stumbled inside, falling to his knees, the ice in his beard cracking. "We are dying, Agnes. Our wood is gone." She looked down at him, her face calm, her eyes revealing nothing. The other men huddled behind him, their bodies shaking uncontrollably. She did not ask them why they had come to her. She did not remind them of the sermons, the whispers, the eviction notice. She did not demand an apology. Her response was a simple, logistical question, the question of a person who deals in practicalities, not emotions. "How many are with you?" Miller stammered. "Everyone. The whole town. We have nothing left." Agnes nodded slowly. She walked to the center of the room, to the worn bearskin rug near the hearth. She bent down and pulled it aside, revealing the thick, planed wood of a trapdoor with an iron ring. The men stared, confused. She pulled the ring, and the heavy door swung upward, a wave of warm, earthy air rising from the darkness below. It was the smell of life. The men's mouths fell open. From the hole in the floor, a soft, steady lantern light glowed. A sturdy ladder descended into the earth. Agnes picked up her own lantern. "Come," she said. "Bring the others. As many as you can. And be careful on the ladder." One by one, the people of Prospect Creek stumbled through the storm to the strange widow's cabin. They came in small, frozen groups, families huddled together, old men leaning on young boys. They were met not with judgment, but with quiet efficiency. Agnes directed them down the ladder, into a world they could not have imagined. They descended from a world of white, howling death into a realm of golden light and profound stillness. They walked down the main corridor, their boots silent on the packed earth floor. They saw the impossible sight of the woodshed, a fortress of fuel stacked to the ceiling. They saw the pantry, its shelves a miracle of abundance, lined with jars of food that shone like jewels in the lantern light. They saw the small, warm living space, a haven of peace. They were speechless, their minds unable to process the scale of what one woman had built beneath their feet. Agnes organized them without fuss. The children and the elderly were settled in the warmest chamber. She started a large pot of stew on the stove, the smell of meat and vegetables filling the air, a scent so good and so long absent it made people weep. She gave them blankets. She gave them warm broth. She did not speak of the past. She simply saw their need and met it. She fed the people who had scorned her, warmed the people who had cast her out, and sheltered the people who had tried to take her home. She did it without a word of reproach, her actions a sermon more powerful than any Reverend Miller had ever delivered. For 5 days, the storm raged. And for 5 days, the entire town of Prospect Creek lived underground, sustained by the foresight of the woman they had rejected. On the 6th day, the wind died. The sun came out, illuminating a world transformed, buried under 20 feet of snow. In the quiet of the tunnel, as people began to stir with the hope of returning to their homes, Reverend Miller found Agnes checking the flue on her stove. He stood there for a long time, watching her. She did not acknowledge him. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and raspy. He did not offer an apology. His pride would not allow for such a direct surrender. Instead, he said, "You read the signs. We only read our own books." He reached into his coat and pulled out a small, worn leather Bible. It was his wife's, her name embossed in faded gold on the cover. He held it out to her. "A book for a book. An acknowledgement of a different kind of scripture, a different kind of faith. Agnes wiped her hands on her apron and took the offered book. She held it for a moment, then looked at him. Her forgiveness, when it came, was as practical and unsentimental as everything else about her. "The earth is a book, too, Reverend," she said. "You just have to learn how to read it." She turned back to her stove, the conversation over. Years passed. The Great Blizzard became a landmark in time, the event that divided the town's history into a before and an after. Agnes never spoke of it. She did not have to. The tunnel, which came to be known as the Widow's Way, became a part of the town's life. It was maintained as a community storm shelter, its pantries kept stocked by a common effort. Agnes taught the other women how to can and preserve, how to read the weather in the behavior of birds and the color of the sky. She taught the men how to brace a wall and vent a stove. She asked for nothing in return. She died 2 decades later, on a warm autumn evening, sitting in her rocking chair on the porch. A half-empty cup of chicory coffee was on the table beside her, still warm. An old, grey-muzzled fen was asleep at her feet. Inside the cabin, a young woman she had taken in years before, an orphan from a neighboring town, was humming as she sorted seeds for the next year's planting. The work was continuing. The town of Prospect Creek paid for her headstone. They buried her next to Thomas. After much debate, they chose a simple epitaph, the only words that seemed to capture the truth of her life. It read, "Agnes. She fed us all. You have a space under your own floor. A gift you have been told is strange, a skill you have been told is useless. A quiet, persistent knowledge you have been taught to ignore because it does not fit the world's expectations. You stand on the trapdoor to it every single day. The question is not whether you have the strength to build your own tunnel. The question is when you will find the courage to simply lift the rug and see what waits in the warm dark below." The trapdoor under the floor was the beginning of her real life, not the end of her old one. True resilience is not built in public. It is dug, in private, one handful at a time. If this story reminded you of the quiet strength that truly holds the world together, subscribe to our channel. There are more people like Agnes, and their stories deserve to be witnessed.